Emma Harper sat in the corner booth, her hands folded tightly around a half-empty glass of water. She was 28, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun and eyes that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. Her coat, a thrift store find with a loose button, hung loosely over her shoulders. The plate in front of her held the remnants of a modest meal, pasta with marinara, a side of garlic bread she hadn't touched. The bill, a small slip of paper tucked under the salt shaker, read $18.75. She hadn't looked at it in 20 minutes, but its presence loomed like a debt collector waiting in the shadows. Emma wasn't supposed to be here. She'd promised herself she'd stop eating out, stop spending what little she had on comforts she couldn't afford. But after a week of cold showers in her cramped apartment, a landlord who'd tacked an extra $50 onto her rent, and a shift cut at the bookstore where she worked, she'd needed an escape. Maggie's place was cheap, quiet, and open late. She'd thought a plate of pasta might dull the ache in her chest, but now, staring at the bill, she felt only regret. Her wallet held $7 in crumpled bills and a handful of change. Her debit card was useless, declined at the grocery store that morning after she'd tried to buy a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. She'd walked away empty-handed, her face burning with shame. Across the diner, Jake Sullivan moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd worked too many double shifts. At 21, he was a junior at Willow Creek Community College, studying biology with dreams of medical school that felt increasingly out of reach. His brown hair was perpetually messy, his apron stained with coffee and ketchup, and his sneakers were so worn the soles were starting to peel. He'd been at Maggie's for 2 years, picking up every shift he could to cover tuition, rent, and the occasional textbook that cost more than a week's groceries. His bank account held $43.12, and his tips from the evening, $12 in crumpled bills and coins, were all he had to get through the weekend. Tuition was due in 2 weeks, and the thought of it made his stomach churn. Jake wiped down a table near the counter, his eyes scanning the diner out of habit. He noticed the small things, the way Mr. Carter, a regular, stirred his coffee exactly 3 times before drinking, the way the fluorescent light above the kitchen door flickered every 10 seconds, the way Emma hadn't touched her bill since he'd set it down. She'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, her posture rigid, her fingers twisting the edge of a napkin into knots. He'd seen that look before, people who came to the diner not just for food but for a moment of refuge, only to realize they couldn't pay for it. He didn't know her story, but he recognized the quiet panic in her eyes. Emma's phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. A text from her sister, Lily, lit up the screen. "You okay? Rent's due tomorrow. Can you cover your half?" Emma's throat tightened. She typed a quick "I'll figure it out" and set the phone face down, her hands trembling. She opened her wallet again, as if the contents might have magically changed. They hadn't. She pressed her palms to her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Not here, not in public. She'd already had enough pitying looks from the cashier at the grocery store. Jake, now at the counter refilling sugar jars, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He didn't stare. He'd learned early on that staring made people feel worse, but he noticed the way Emma's shoulders slumped, the way her fingers hovered over her wallet before snapping it shut. He'd been there, or close to it. Last semester, he'd skipped meals for a week to afford a used chemistry textbook. He'd walked 3 miles to campus when his car wouldn't start and he couldn't spare the bus fare. He knew what it was to count coins and pray they added up. The diner's manager, Tom, a gruff man with a permanent scowl, was in the back office, probably tallying receipts. The cook, Maria, was scrubbing the grill, her radio playing softly in Spanish. The other waitress, Sarah, had clocked out an hour ago. It was just Jake and a handful of customers now, the night winding down. He glanced at Emma again, then at his own tips in his apron pocket. $12. Not enough to cover his own groceries, let alone anything else. But something about Emma's stillness, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, tugged at him. He walked to the register, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. The old machine hummed as he punched in a few keys, pulling up Emma's bill. $18.75. He smoothed out his tips, 2 5s, a couple of 1s, and a handful of quarters, and added $7 from his own wallet, coins he'd been saving for laundry. His hands moved quickly, almost instinctively, as he marked the bill as paid in the system. He didn't think about the bus fare he'd need tomorrow or the ramen packets he'd have to stretch for another week. He didn't think about the way Tom might chew him out if he noticed the discrepancy. He just did it. Emma finally reached for the bill, her heart pounding. She'd been rehearsing what to say. Maybe she could offer to wash dishes, or come back tomorrow with the money, though she had no idea how she'd manage that. But when she looked at the table, the slip of paper was gone. She blinked, confused, her eyes darting around the booth. Had she misplaced it? Had someone taken it? She looked up, her gaze landing on Jake, who was now sweeping the floor near the counter, his movements steady and unhurried. "Excuse me," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Excuse me." Jake looked up, his expression neutral. "Yeah, my bill, it's not here. I think there's a mistake. I haven't paid yet." He shrugged, leaning on the broom. "It's taken care of," he said, his tone as casual as if he'd just refilled her water. "Happens sometimes." Emma frowned, her mind racing. "What do you mean, taken care of? I didn't pay. Someone must have," Jake said, his eyes flicking back to the floor. "Don't worry about it." Emma's breath caught. The diner was nearly empty. Mr. Carter was still nursing his coffee, and a trucker in a flannel shirt was reading a newspaper at the counter. Neither had even looked her way. She studied Jake, his lanky frame, his worn apron, the way he avoided her gaze. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. She wasn't naive. She knew what he'd done, or at least she suspected it. But why? She was a stranger, just another customer. Why would he cover her bill when he looked like he was barely getting by himself? I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why would someone do that?" Jake paused, his broom stilling for a moment. He met her eyes, just for a second, and there was something there, empathy, maybe, or understanding. "People help out sometimes," he said simply. "No big deal." Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. She saw the way he went back to sweeping, his movements deliberate, unassuming. He wasn't looking for thanks or recognition. He wasn't waiting for her to make a scene. He'd done it quietly, without a word, and now he was moving on. She gathered her coat and bag, her hands still shaking. As she stood, she felt the weight of the week, the landlord, the bookstore, the empty fridge, press against her, but it was lighter now, just a fraction. She walked toward the door, her steps slow, and turned back one last time. Jake was still sweeping, his back to her, but she caught the faintest nod of his head, as if he knew she was looking. "Thank you," she whispered, so softly she wasn't sure he'd hear. He didn't turn around, but he nodded again, just once, and kept sweeping. Emma stepped outside, the cool autumn air biting at her cheeks. The neon sign buzzed above her, and the street was quiet, save for the distant hum of a passing car. She pulled her coat tighter, her mind replaying the moment. She didn't know Jake's name, didn't know he'd given up his last few dollars, didn't know he'd walked 2 miles home that night because he couldn't afford the bus. But she felt something shift inside her, a small spark of hope that maybe the world wasn't as cold as it had seemed an hour ago. Jake finished his shift an hour later, his legs aching from standing all day. He clocked out, hung his apron on the hook, and pocketed nothing but the weight of his own choices. Tom didn't notice the paid bill, and Maria was too busy singing to her radio to care. Jake didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He didn't need to. He'd seen the look in Emma's eyes, the way her shoulders had lifted just slightly as she left. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As he locked the diner's back door and started the long walk home, the wind cutting through his thin jacket, he thought about his own bills, his own empty fridge. But he also thought about the way Emma had whispered her thanks, the way she'd looked at him like he'd given her more than just a free meal. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest acts were enough to keep someone else going. And for tonight, that was enough for him.